Well, welcome everyone to the Lotteries and Democracy Conference, generously sponsored by Yale ISPS. We know that many of you have traveled great distances from Europe and the other side of the country to be here, and we're really, really happy to have you here. So I'm going to begin by presenting work from a book that myself and Brenda van Coppenolle, who's over there, are writing on the historical uses of lotteries throughout cases in Europe. But I'm first going to start broader by giving you a motivation. So if you haven't noticed, democracy is in crisis, right? Or at least this is a pervasive narrative, both in academia and in the policy sphere. This is very much the case in America, but also in Western democracies in Europe, all over the place, right? So we think that democracy is broken. And increasingly, there's lots of reasons why, right? The rise of extremism, radicalism in politics, the decline of parties, strong parties and kind of traditional party membership. Campaign finance means that elections are increasingly bought by wealthy elites, often kind of non-political elites. There's a lot of corruption. There's increasingly democratic backsliding, although we're kind of arguing about when, where, why, and how to define it. And also declining trust in institutions. So across the world, we're seeing people don't have trust in government, they don't have trust in politics, they don't have trust in democracy. And I'm going to argue that the real problem is that voters neither feel included nor represented in a system that's increasingly dominated by elites. So everyday voters are increasingly set apart from democracy. Okay, so there are lots of ways to fix all of these problems, but how do we fix this last one? Lotteries increasingly have been advocated as a solution, right? And so these are all kind of recent headlines. Can randomly selected citizens govern better than elected officials? Should we give power to ordinary people? Voting undermines the will of the people. It's time to replace it with sortition, okay? And just in case you think that this is just kind of a popular topic for op-eds, it's easy to throw out sortition and autocracies, but maybe this isn't a real policy idea. These are happening all over the world, right? So deliberative institutions, bodies that are selecting random people to have an active role in policymaking, sometimes consultative, sometimes advisory, are happening all over the world and have been happening for quite a long time. So that's Belgium in 2011, Paris recently in 2023, East Belgium, Ireland. A lot of democracies are now innovating by selecting citizens and bringing them into policy, typically paired with deliberative democracy. Okay, and so what's interesting, and we think, all of these innovations are great, but Brenda and I set out to write a book that's very much in the historical political economy tradition, right? And so our book, which is going to come out as a Cambridge Elements in Political Economy, it's called Lotteries and Democracy, we chose to look back in time at all of the cases that throughout history where actually governing bodies use lotteries in their standing assemblies. And the nice thing is that we can use the historical cases to give us actual empirical data on how these work, how these function, what worked, what didn't, why were they put in place, and why were they dismantled. And hopefully this can help inform the use of lotteries in permanent governing assemblies today. And in the book, I'm not going to present the whole book today. I'm just going to give you kind of a really fun chapter. But in the book, we assess kind of whether lotteries improved representation and prevented elite capture. These are kind of the two main reasons why we advocate for lotteries, or why policymakers are advocating for lotteries. And we also look at things like implementation, which is often missed in these kind of high-level op-eds, right? So screening, auditing, what's the composition of the pool? Are there any selection effects that we need to deal with? And so today I'm going to quickly review the motivation for why kind of historical policymakers and modern policymakers want to turn to lotteries. And then we're going to look at a natural experiment of deliberative committees in Denmark. Denmark wrote their constitution in deliberative committees. And so we're going to look to the past to get kind of cool results about Denmark, and then I'll conclude. Okay, so definitions, at least, I told all presenters to define their terms because we all use kind of similar terminology, but just to make sure we're on the same page. So when we talk about lotteries, we're talking about the selection of political representatives by lottery. Sometimes this is called sortition. You can call this lotocratic selection. You can call this selection by lot. But note that most modern uses of lotteries involve some sort of stratified random sampling, right? So we're trying to choose a representative snapshot of society, but we are weighting the random sampling on things like gender, geographic location, etc. Why do you select people by lottery? It improves representation and equalizes access to power, so people that are not elite have a chance to be at the table. It's anti-corruption, and it kind of prevents elite capture. You can't buy off, at least not before the election, you can't buy off someone if you don't know who's going to kind of be chosen. Same with campaign finance. It eliminates the need for campaign finance if you're choosing officials by lottery. And so these are some of the reasons why we might want to use lotteries in democratic governance, right? But what's really great, and this is also kind of a preface to the entire conference, is that lotteries can be used to select a wide range of democratic institutions and in many different ways. So for you political scientists that study kind of comparative institutions, it's like electoral law. You can slice and dice random selection at different levels. You can make it permanent. You can make it not permanent. You can have hybrid systems where you have a sortition chamber and an elected chamber. There's lots of really interesting ways to incorporate lotteries in democratic governance, and that is actually the motivation behind this conference. Today, you're going to see many, many ways to use lotteries and ways that we think can improve democracy. Yeah, Kostas. Yeah. Yeah.
How would you think about the lotteries being self-selective, like choosing how to choose? There's all these debates on choice. If the system should be choosing itself, right? So would the lottery choose that as would be like some sort of an equilibrium where lottery would be self-selective?
Ah.
And second question, would it be interesting to examine lotteries as an intermediate step, so not like directly going to selection of candidates, but selecting the committees or the selectorate, right? That goes back a little bit to ancient Greece, where how they're selecting the juries, right?
Yep.
So you have the lottery or the generals for every public office, right? They weren't directly selecting who's the troop or the soldier or whatever. They would select by lottery the committee who would then select.
Yep. Exactly. Kostas, I love your questions because our book answers both of those. I'm not kidding. So the first, are lotteries, I'm going to rephrase it, are lotteries a stable equilibrium? Yeah, Alan, do you have a two-finger?
Yeah, Alan, when the first time a person asks a question or says something, can they introduce themselves and just say, like, pick up I'm blah from blah to blah?
Yeah, great idea, Alan. Thank you. Kostas, please introduce yourself. Okay, great. Thank you, Kostas. Great questions. So, one, are lotteries a stable equilibrium? And we actually show in the book that lotteries, and this is not a chapter that I'm going to present, but it relates to the roles of parties. I'm going to discuss the role of parties in this historical case quite a bit. It is the case that we found historically lotteries work best kind of in new democracies, in unstable environments where you don't have strong parties to control selection. So it's kind of a rule that everyone can agree upon to organize the society because it's fair, right? Lotteries are fair, they're irrational. You know, it's not the strongest or someone from this part of the Italian city-states controlling, you know, the currency. We like choosing by lottery. However, we show, and actually the Third Republic in France is a great example of this. We have a JOP in a World Politics on this that showed that parties were fine with lotteries for decades while they were weak. As soon as parties got strong, you want to be able to choose access to committees, you want to be able to choose everything, so they take them away. And we argue in the book that this is actually important to realize that it's not the case that parties, especially strong parties, you know, hundreds of years later, thousands of years later, right, won't necessarily allow this rule to kind of supplant them. And so in the panel, we're going to talk about the relationship between parties and autocracy, and is it going to be a productive relationship or not. So no, it's not a stable equilibrium, at least not what we can tell from the historical cases. And then we do in the book study what we call lottery-based procedures, which is where you're selecting, you're using a two-stage process. You split the chamber into random groups. Those random groups then elect a representative. So you don't choose the representative by lottery, but you choose the groups by lottery, and then they elect the person. And even that like kind of intermediate step we show improves representation and gets people onto committees that wouldn't have before. So even a little bit of lottery helps, but I'll go back to that in a second. Great questions, though, Kostas. Great to have you here. Okay, so you can, lotteries can be used to select a wide range of democratic institutions, and they have been. right? So the deliberative wave, and what's interesting is, last night at dinner, we were kind of comparing notes like, oh, have you heard about the Paris one? Oh, have you heard about Milan is doing now deliberative democracy? Have you heard about, what's going on in New York or California? This is such a burgeoning field that this is actually outdated. So this is the OECD keeping track of all these kind of deliberative initiatives. And again, deliberative democracy uses lotteries to choose the citizens that are involved in the debate, coming together to kind of debate policy and then provide recommendations. This is only till 2021, but as you see, we're at the beginning of a very steep incline. So all of these institutions are something we really need to pay attention to, right? Now, what's interesting is that, so most of these are involving citizens, although there are some exceptions. Paris and Belgium are exceptions where they're incorporating politicians to work with citizens in kind of these deliberative committees. But most of these are citizens, and a lot of our academic research are focusing on whether everyday people learn, have positive participation, change their minds, have more trust in government after participating. But Brenda and I are actually interested in the historical cases where we're at higher levels with permanent governing assemblies with actual politicians, right? And so that's what our book is focused on. And prior research also sometimes is a bit kind of prescriptive and hypothetical, which is great. We need normative theorists and philosophers thinking about the core definitions of democracy, but Brenda and I are empiricists, and so we think that we can use kind of real data and statistical analysis to hopefully shed light on how lotteries work at very high levels, right? And high levels of decision-making with professional politicians, with political parties. We don't necessarily think that some of the great findings from citizens' assemblies would transfer up. And so for political science professors, all of you political science professors are nodding. If you've ever dealt with politicians, these might be the slowest to update. And so our book looks at politicians, high levels with actual governing stakes. So they were choosing the currency, they were choosing the budget, how the budget would be allocated in France, they were writing the Constitution. Okay, and Kostas, your lottery-based procedures show up in the book. They show up in the 19th century French case. The cases that we look at a lot of different historical cases that each use lotteries in a different way, so the book is pretty expansive. We look at ancient Athens, which was more of a lotocracy where they're actually selecting the officials. We look at medieval Italy, where they chose the standard bearer in Florence. They were choosing, again, economic kind of leaders. Denmark and France, we look at constitutions. So France and Denmark wrote their constitutions in deliberative groups, kind of mimicking the citizens' assemblies that have provided advisory powers. But again, these are politicians writing the constitution. And then the lottery-based procedures in 19th century Europe, which is this two-stage selecting committees. So I'm going to talk about Denmark today, but importantly, our book shows that there's a lot of different ways to incorporate lotteries, and again, our big findings are that generally they do improve representation if you can keep them. Okay, I kind of went over this, so I'll go quickly, but overall, we do find that kind of across the cases, lotteries do improve representation, but it also depends on the pool. So one thing that's kind of missing from all of these policymakers and all of these op-eds saying we should go back to sortition, if you want to undermine lotteries, you mess with the pool that they're originally chosen from, and that's what Greece did, right? So ancient Athens, the pool was restrictive. It was not everyone in the polity, it was effectively elites. So if you restrict the pool and then randomly select, you don't get necessarily the benefits of increased representation, although it can still be kind of anti-corruption, right? So we need to take a step back, and that's some of the projects I'm working on this year while I'm visiting Yale, to think about self-selection to lotteries and think about how to make the pool expansive but also tractable to kind of scale up, right? Yeah, Kevin.
Sorry, Kevin Elliott here at Yale and EP&E. So when you mean representative here, you mean the groups that are selected will look more like the body as a whole, is that correct?
Yeah, and in particular, trying to think about groups that would not normally be in politics if, typical elites and elections were in place, yeah. Anyway, so pay attention to the pool, right? Again, you can have a great policy, but if you mess with a step before the policy, it can undermine the benefits of the policy. Yep, it does prevent elite capture, but strong parties will dismantle lotteries, at least in Europe, that's what happened. And yes, we can learn from implementation, so things like screening, auditing, giving individual representatives chosen by lottery help and support, all of that would be important if you actually want to bring lotteries up to governing assemblies. But anyway, so that's kind of the preview of the findings of the book. But today, for the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about whether a historical case can teach us about deliberative committees. And deliberative committees are when you're kind of bringing citizens and politicians to debate, discuss, and make policy recommendations, but policy recommendations that will influence policy and are more advisory. So we're going to look at the creation of the June Constitution in Denmark. This is the constitution that governs Denmark to this day. So if we're thinking about high stakes, this was not a temporary document. They wrote, this document existed, it's been amended, of course, but in these deliberative groups. And we're going to exploit a natural experiment that created these groups. We're going to see if they did anything. And we're going to measure whether they did anything by looking at voting on constitutional amendments. So did people get more democratic as they deliberated into these groups? And we test whether kind of this group assignment, thinking of this group assignment as a treatment, affected your legislative behavior. And another great thing about this case is that obviously we have no survey measures, self-reported. Did you have a great time, Danish politicians in the 19th century, deliberating these groups? We can't do that. But we have what's even better, which is we have the votes, which would be consequential, right? You can say you had a great time in a deliberative exercise and then not change your mind, your behavior, or your attitudes, right? And I'm not saying that's happening in modern-day citizens' assemblies, but the nice thing is that we have actual costly outcomes to measure using this historical case. And then we're kind of speaking to theories about deliberation in mixed groups. This is a very short list, but there have been mixed findings. Sometimes you think that if you get into deliberative groups, you're exposed to different viewpoints and you moderate, you learn. You become less polarized, less cohesive. We've had experimental work show this, and we've had observational work show this. But it's also the case that, exposures to different viewpoints might reinforce your existing opinions, right? You might double down, or just might not change your opinions. And again, we have very few studies that use actual politicians, and the studies that do use actual politicians in Ireland, where they've had deliberative committees before, often show that politicians are kind of less likely to moderate and less likely to change because they have different concerns, right? They're very concerned about public relations and the PR consequences of participating in these deliberative committees, but again, does that translate into actual policy change, or do they just fall back to partisan lines? There are less kind of happy results when you use politicians, so these are the literatures that we're speaking to. Okay, Denmark, 19th century. So that's the Constituent Assembly. Obviously, all of our politicians are men because, history. Okay, Denmark was kind of an interesting case of democratization. So Europe was facing a wave of revolutions in 1848. Denmark was at war. The Danish king saw the way the wind was blowing and decided to cede the country to create a democratic republic. He was called Frederick the Beloved because of this, so he did very well in history. But it's a bit unusual case that Denmark didn't get kind of toppled by a revolution like France did. The Danish king was like, okay, let's create a constituent assembly. I'll stay a constitutional monarch, but let's create a constitution, right? So this happened in 1848, and the Constitution was adopted in 1849, so we're talking really about a year and kind of a smaller period for deliberation and voting. And there's there's some good work on kind of roll call voting in the case, but generally there's not a lot of studies on this case, which maybe because it's not conflict or war oriented, it was a peaceful transition, so everyone studies France and not Denmark. Okay, so the parties. Parties are going to play an important role, and this is a great case because the parties were weak but existing. So they stood on ideological platforms, or they had labels for themselves when they ran to be elected to the Constituent Assembly. But luckily for us, the blocs are pretty traditional, 19th century Europe. The left was a movement of rich farmers. They were not peasants, but they wanted democracy, they wanted representation. The national liberals were the ones that actually pushed for the Constitution. These are kind of the merchants in the cities. They want democracy, but they kind of want to run it. They don't want the rich farmers to run it, so they're like medium pro-democracy. And then you have the right, which are aristocratic, buddies with the king. Everyone has accepted that we need to have a democracy, but there's a spectrum on how inclusive, how democratic, how much the king has power to really kind of dissolve the assembly. And so that's what they're going to be fighting over in the Constitution. Okay. And parties institutions were new and weak, right? So they said, hey, let's look at what France did. France had a solution for kind of an unstable environment, and that's how France did their constitution. Let's do that. And so anti-democratic elites, they were worried about kind of blocking democracy, so they decided to use lotteries. So they used these random deliberative groups. And the rationale, and we can see that from the parliamentary debate, so why did they put this rule in place? It was to expose members to cross-cutting debate, to make people get into a room with other parties, other members that they didn't know, to let ideas flow better. So exactly the same rationales we have today. Okay, so our Constituent Assembly has 157 elected or king-appointed members. 5 of them went off to be ministers, so it ends up being 152. We have 5 deliberative groups. So they deliberated in groups of 30 or 31, which is relatively large, but they stayed in these groups the whole time, right? So we're going to kind of exploit these groups to see if over these kind of 6 months there was learning. They debated the Constitution draft, and then we have the roll call votes in the General Assembly where they voted on each of these parts of the Constitution. And again, 3 parties. And then the king was kind of in the background. The king actually appointed deputies to make sure that there were folks protecting his interests, because the election for the Constituent Assembly went really left. But because the king interfered, you basically have equal numbers of each blocks across the chamber. Okay, so what we're trying to ask using this case is, does policy deliberation in randomly assigned groups affect voting behavior on the draft constitution? What the hypothesis is that if these randomly assigned groups expose members to these new viewpoints, we should see behavioral change. The way we decide to operationalize this is by looking at the number of left-wing deputies, or here I'm going to show you the share of left-wing deputies in your group, with this idea that they were the most democratic. If you were a liberal or a right-wing deputy and you were exposed to more of these left-wing deputies, you would maybe move closer to them. That is a choice. That is a substantive choice. We also look at the number of right-wing deputies, right? Because you might be affected by the other tails. Yeah, Kevin.
Was universal mandate suffrage, was that on the table? Was that the...
Yeah, that some of the votes that we have were the titling land requirements for suffrage. And so, and it works exactly like you think. The rich farmers wanted inclusive suffrage, and then, the right wanted like only very, very rich elite. Yeah, so they have like a series of votes, which, spoiler alert, the rich farmers lost. Yeah. Okay. So we use a lot of cool historical data. So we use the parliamentary records, we use the roll call voting. We go look to see whether these individual parliamentarians had served in politics before, whether they were nobility, all sorts of really cool, rich microdata. If you have questions, I'm going to skip over that, but it's nice. And again, we're going to look at 44 roll call votes on the amendments to the Constitution. We coded these. We went and looked at the substance, and we coded these as pro-democratic or not. And these are suffrage, whether the king can dissolve parliament. We use 19 of them that are really, really clear. Like if you're voting for an increase in who can stand for office, you are pro-democratic or not. And there's, I can go into details if anyone has questions. And then again, our treatment is the member of this random group composition, the share of left deputies. Okay, and this is, you can kind of see the variation we're exploiting, right? So here, these are the party blocks. So blue is left, yellow, orange is center, and red is the right. And then you have some free shooters independents. It's kind of fun. In Denmark, they called them free shooters if you were an independent, but they kind of do their own thing. So typically, we're only looking at the blocks. But you see variation, right? Can you see this mouse? Yeah. So here, this group has a very small proportion of left-wing deputies. This group has kind of a plurality portion of left-wing deputies. And we're trying to see if deliberation in this group versus this group, namely the number of left-wing pro-democracy people in your group, changes your mind. Okay, and this is a legislator vote panel data set. And again, we're exploiting the fact that the group assignment was random. Okay, so now to get to the results. So we first look at cohesion. This is just descriptive to see if you're debating with the same people. So this is kind of like if we randomly moved you guys all to tables and you spent 6 months debating, would Kostas and Dimitri, vote with more likely to vote with each other, or would this table vote with each other? Not parties, but your assigned group. And so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, these are each of the assigned group. And the x-axis is effectively time, and this is a Rice index. So the higher the Rice index, the more cohesive you are. And as you can see, nothing mildly negative. So it's not the case that you form a group identity with your deliberative groups. Even though you're in these groups every day debating these constitution, you tend to vote kind of however you want. Yeah, Kenzie.
Hi, Kenzie Locker at ISPS. How much time actually goes on between the 40 roll call votes? Like, is that months, weeks, days?
Yeah, so it's about 6 months. So it kind of starts in January and then ends in May. And you'll see like if, for those of you who study kind of parliamentary behavior, you'll see kind of clusters. So it's not like they had one every week. They did all the suffrage ones, and they debated for a while, and they did all of the, We kind of, you can look to see, we don't think that time is really, playing a huge role, which is why it's not, it's an index as a vote, not like a weekly, because they were kind of 3 clusters, right? But good question. Okay, we see minor effects for party blocks. So again, this was deliberative group, flat lines. We'd expect it to be positive if we thought that there was a group identity. Here we see kind of mildly positive, again, over time. So like the left is a little bit up, center, right. This is also, again, these were new parties. The democracy didn't exist yet. They were creating it, but we see a little bit more of an effect for parties than we do deliberative groups. Okay, and now results. And so here you're going to see the dependent variable we're trying to predict is pro-democracy voting. And I'm going to use this. I'm not going to move, but I'm going to use this. This is the coefficient we care about, which is the share of left deputies. Okay, we're going to look at this panel first. 2 models, one with individual controls, one with not. But again, we're exploiting the random assignment of the treatment. Nothing. Nothing and pretty close to 0. So there's no effect of the number of left deputies on your voting behavior. There is an effect of what party you're in, right? So compared to the left, so the left is the base case here, the center and right were less likely to vote for democracy. So that follows, right? So here what this is showing is that the deliberative group is not having effect while early partisanship is. If you conceptualize this differently as the number of right deputies, so you swing over to the other tail, again, we have no effect, and again, you see the left and some of the center are more likely to vote for democracy. But I'm going to show you a difference, which is looking at heterogeneous treatment effects, because we would imagine that, if you're a left-wing deputy, the number of left-wing deputies is not going to change you because you're already with them. So we split them into what party you are. So this is only left deputies. Are they affected by either the share of left deputies or right deputies? Nope. Only center deputies? Nope. Only right deputies? Nope. Okay, so a lot of nope. What does this mean? We do other robustness because, again, we're kind of limited by it's a small sample. That's the downside of historical cases. The data we have is or the data I've shown you is the data we have. We do randomization inference to see kind of how likely these null results would be, and it kind of does support our claims. We do a couple other things, but generally, we don't have evidence using the historical case that these deliberative groups were significantly impacting these high-stakes votes, right? And so what we think that this historical case can teach us about modern-day lotteries, so we do find partisan effects, and even early partisan effects. And again, if you're a political scientist and you study how deeply rooted partisan identity is, and the incentives of politicians to represent their constituents or just pursue their own policy preferences while in office, you might see this and say, yeah, like why would these deliberative groups have an effect if they came into the Constitution wanting to observe their goals? Maybe this is not surprising. But it is important because, again, this is a study of actual politicians over a long period of time debating something that was high stakes. So we think that this is a really nice historical case to inform and teach us about how politicians would work with maybe lotteries today. And again, we need to be a little bit cautious, although I think we need more research in higher level bodies, and it's great to see all of you practitioners here. I'm going to talk to you about this later. But finally, and we'll get back to this at the end of the panel, the lottocracy literature doesn't know what to do with parties, right? So at the very best, they say, well, they can exist as extra parliamentary organizations. Parties don't have to leave if we have a Congress chosen entirely by lottery. But it is the case that these professional politicians with well-oiled machines, and Dimitri's work actually talks about this, could still influence politics. And we should assume that they will still try to influence politics. And hybrid systems that combine politicians and citizens, these are going to be powerful players with maybe preferences that won't be as easy to moderate. Doesn't mean we can't do it, but we need to be aware that at high levels, citizens might be more likely to update than politicians. Okay, so I'm going to conclude there and take any questions you might have about lotteries, about Denmark, or just in general discussion. Do what you will. Yeah. Kevin.
Thanks. So this is more like a suggestion, I suppose. So
yeah.
I totally agree with you about lotocrats and lotocracy not really knowing what to do with parties. And I wonder to what extent, since I'm like a political theorist, democratic theorist,
Yeah.
so like, data. But I wonder to what extent what's operating here.
I wonder, so I'm not loud enough. Okay.
It's good. I can hear you great.
Yes. So, and I guess the tape does. Right. So my question is basically about representation, right? So I asked about this before.
Yep.
Because I think one of the things that might be happening here is, and I think I've read a lot about this, that Lottocrats, insofar as they are thinking about representation at all, which I think there's a lot of division within the debate about this.
Yeah.
Some Lottocrats will say we are trying to, representation has failed. We're going to a form of direct democracy that circumvents representation altogether, because that was the problem of your original conception of, the problem is voters feel that they're being governed by disconnected elites.
Yeah.
So what we
Yeah.
want to do is eliminate elites. That position, there's been a lot of pressure put on that position, right, within the literature. Our colleague here at Yale, Len Landemore, has kind of moved sort of away from that position and toward a position that's like, no, the randomly selected citizens conceive of themselves as representatives, but it's a different kind of representation. And so that's what I would sort of want to suggest here, that maybe, one of the fault lines that's running through here, I think, is that parties are simply approaching or are in a way based on a completely different conception of representation in democracies. What is representation? It's electing more or less ideological or programmatic groups who are going to govern in line with those promises. And Lottocracy, well, we're going to have ordinary people think about the issues or something, right? It's like again, they're sort of working on what exactly that means. So, like I said, it's not so much a question as a comment. I wonder to what extent, though, that you see this. You could imagine seeing elements of this play out if you do some kind of substantive analysis of the debates, where it's like, look, I'm here to represent the interests of the groups that I'm a part of or the party, as opposed to, oh yeah, you make a good point, and so I'm going to abandon my party's position because we're here to deal with the issues in this unmediated way. I think that's more of the conception that Lottocrats have had coming out of the deliberative tradition, and that you talk about here, right? When you would expect people to change their minds, it's because they're arriving into the decision space with a different task. Are we considering the issues substantively, or are we bringing some kind of authorization with us or something like that? Sorry.
No, that's a really great point, too. And everyone should meet Theo. So Theo's a postdoc associated with the Democratic Innovations Program and works with LN. Theo is doing a conference and studying exactly that, right? Because they've found increasingly that even if you're chosen by lottery, citizens feel like they have a job to do. Like they were chosen to, again, represent something. And it's kind of interesting because are they chosen, like a politician elected in a district has, very clear mandates, like schools, stuff for that district. Those are the people that are going to elect him, versus someone who's chosen by lottery. They feel like they need to be representative, but sometimes it varies by person. So they need to represent their class. They need to represent their geographic area. But it's much more expansive, but there still is a level of responsibility. And so that's what Theo's working on. So everyone go talk to Theo. He'll be here at some point. So I think that's true. And what's interesting is, so in the historical cases, we're looking, Brenda and I are looking at a wide range. And what's interesting is the idea of representation also changes, right? So from ancient Greece to then 19th century Europe, 19th century Europe politicians, they were like, well, I know best. I'm going to do these. But these were elites who thought that, we were kind of in the era of should citizens even be involved in this, right? So they had an idea of a mandate, but the mandate was, I'm elite. I can decide this for the people. But there still was kind of this idea of representation. And we had, one of the policymakers that was instrumental in setting up the Belgian committees was here a couple weeks ago, Jonathan Moskovic. Super, super interesting work. And he was talking about also it depends on the politician. So some politicians that have participated in these deliberative committees, and the politicians can self-select in, which is important. So the citizens are chosen randomly, but the politicians who work on the issue or who want to do that self-select. So again, the selection effect. So and theoretically, these politicians would be the one who are interested in this, want to learn. Some politicians are, they believe in the cause. They believe in this type of democratic innovation. They believe in the structure. They believe they can learn something. So they go into it being open to updating and open to listening to citizens. And then they said other politicians are doing it for the photo op, basically. And so that's not a politician versus citizen. That's variation within individual politicians. And what's interesting is that in Belgium, it's the Green Party, or at least Jonathan was working with the Green Party. So the climate, the liberal, those politicians really believe in the cause and are kind of open to it, while other politicians doing other topics are less. So some of this might not be a levels, it might be individual variation, convince politicians that this is a good exercise, maybe they will be less likely to dominate the discussion. Because they surveyed the citizens after the Belgian experiment, and some of the citizens were like, yeah, politicians like to talk, and they like to dominate the conversation, and they are skilled, right? If you think about juries, right, some folks are, professors, or maybe often we're on fewer juries because it is our job to convince people that we're right. Maybe that would not be great in a jury system. But yeah, great questions, Kevin. Yeah, Dimitri.
Dimitri, do you have a sense of how much pressure these members of parliamentary randomly selected groups were from their respective parties to maintain the party line? And how much that might have affected the outcomes you're observing?
Yeah, so what's interesting is that, because you look at there were weak parties where they had kind of labels, and we assume, in the historical record, it seems to indicate that they did kind of caucus, and especially the king appointed deputies kind of had a different mandate, right? But the problem is that there weren't, the records are kind of, the historical data is a bit, so were there party meetings? Did they meet by the water cooler? Did they meet in the tavern and conceptualize themselves as a party? There wasn't any kind of whipping or sticks and carrots that a party institution could use to make their members vote. It was more kind of ideological kind of preferences. And if you think about kind of Kriebel's Where's the Party, at least, parties didn't have a lot, so anything that kept them together would have been either shared preferences because they want all the stuff for themselves, or kind of these networks where they all knew each other and they did. And you can see, if you do roll call scaling, the three groups are visible across the additional votes that are not pro-democracies because they were fighting a war, so there's military votes, and they were cohesive. They were doing stuff kind of together, and there wasn't a lot of things that parties didn't have access to anything because this was just a constituent assembly. But past that, we're not sure to what extent there were extra parliamentary meetings to help coordinate behavior. Yeah.
Do you have any evidence of pamphlets, party pamphlets being put out at that time, articulating a party position or articulating a particular platform? These pamphlets being written maybe by activists or by people who were influential with the party leadership, anything that would suggest attempts to maintain a particular party line in the broader discursive context?
So the only thing that I remember is, or the closest thing to that would be, so I told you the Constituent Assembly went to the left, right? So they had this election for this Constituent Assembly, electing these deputies, and the rich farmers, the Society for the Friends of the Peasants, mobilized. So they had they had soapboxes. They were like, oh, we want our interests represented. That's why they did so well in the election. And the king and the elites were like, where'd you come from? Wait, turnout? We need a turnout? These peasants have never turned, or these kind of farmers in rural areas have never turned out before. And that's why the king had to get involved and be like, well, you actually won the election, but here are my people. Let's even the scales. But it was on the left. It was on the ones that would be the most pro-democratic, kind of early, and exactly you think the cadre parties and the grassroots parties. The reason the left, but they were the most in terms of pushing for the democracy, while the other two parties, a lot of historical record, were much looser. They wanted to protect their own power, but they were used to being in power, so the idea that you had to mobilize totally shocked them in the beginning. Yeah, but we could look at that more. That's actually that's a good idea. And you can do text analysis with all the debates and stuff. We have not, but there's now OCR and digitization is getting better, so you can actually look to see, if voting is not the best outcome to measure, how else could you measure? You could maybe measure speeches. So maybe they have to vote the way they were going to, but if you have any evidence of changing their mind, maybe the language that they use changes as a function of this group. But that would require a bit more thinking, how to measure that. Yeah, Kevin.
Yeah. So in the Irish case, right, in the first one that they had, it was a
mix of citizens and politicians.
Right.
And it was precisely issues that split the parties, right? So
Mm-hmm.
whatever the official position was of the party, the whole point of why they were kicking the decisions over to the citizens' assembly was because they didn't really have unified positions that that neatly divided the parties. They were kind of like, we don't want to make this decision about abortion. We don't want to make this. I forget which one, if it was marriage equality or abortion, the first one. But
Mhm.
they were
Yeah,
like, we
they
don't
were-
want to make this decision.
Yeah.
It splits our parties. So it'd be interesting to see. There might be variation in the votes, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's also kind of like a third party, like, oh, we're divided. What do the citizens say? You know, if they had done that for Brexit before the UK parties made the biggest mistake of this generation, like maybe we would not be. Maybe you UK people would not be in the state you're in. Yeah, Brenda. Brenda, can you get the mic? Where's the?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Brenda from Sciences Po. So one thing I would add to that is that the picture that you didn't show today, but that we also have about the roll call scaling shows that these parties, great, yeah, that's the one.
Yeah.
Shows that these parties are not clearly distinct and apart, right? So there's some overlap between some individuals, and that's really good evidence for the fact that you don't have these parties really imposing their party lines.
Yeah. Christian.
Hey, I'm Christian Gross from the University of Southern California, and you mentioned up front about the selection into the deliberative processes and choosing citizens broadly as more representative as you've defined it. What were the other ways to pick people? Like, did they choose on competence or expertise, or who the parties wanted? Like, can you just talk a little bit more about the selection in when it wasn't truly random of all citizens?
Yeah, I mean, so in some of these early cases, I mean, like elections weren't like they were today. Like sometimes they were indirect, or the elections were only, you know, if you think about like the British cases, the Victorian vote buying, you know. So most of the time when we're comparing autocratic selection, like the baseline would be election, if we're talking about like choosing individuals to sit in a representative body. Once we're in the assembly, typically, so like if you didn't choose who was on the budget committee using this kind of two-step procedure, it would be parties, right? It'd be party groups, and of those parties, it would be elites in the parties, like the party leaders or like the high-level people. And actually, we show in the French case that parties, you know, they use this lottery-based procedure to choose the most powerful committee, like the one that controlled the money. And then once parties got strong, they dismantled it and then went back to parties choose who go on the budget committee. And you can see that like the general representation of the budget committee, like the average, you know, who was on it, like where they were coming from, their background drops, right? So elites go back on as soon as parties can choose. Now, there's kind of a larger question here, which is, you know, the idea that parties can use these committees as, you know, sticks and carrots. That might be good for parties, like using random selection for committees takes that away from parties. It also takes the ability of people to develop expertise. So there are trade-offs, actually. Either it's not, we don't think parties are bad. Sometimes parties can use this to like build seniority, but it is the case that, at least in the European cases that we studied, that, you know, we were kind of like the middle class deputy was on the budget committee, and then once parties got it, it went back to being elites. But one thing that I'm looking at, and I will end on this point, is, so, you know, when we're thinking about how take-up, and this is, I'm working on a survey experiment to kind of tease this out, but if we're thinking about take-up, so I randomly invite you all to a citizens' assembly, you know, and we make sure that there's, you know, female from Texas, you know, they say no. We find another female from Texas, they say yes, right? If there is an unobservable that has nothing to do with the random sampling that makes the one that said no not liking democracy kind of a dissident, and the one that said yes just already predisposed to like citizens' assemblies or to have different outcomes, I mean, that might happen. That, you know, from a practical side, like we can't, you know, control all of the unobservables that would make people want to give up their weekend to talk about climate, but interpreting our findings, we need to understand more about this selection, because it's not the case, the invitation is random, the take-up is not random. And the more we understand take-up, and what I'm looking at is actually polarization. So in cases like the US or even the UK, you know, you might think it's fine to discuss kind of municipal budgeting, but if I know that I'm gonna talk with a bunch of out partisans, like the opposing partisans, about Black Lives Matter for a weekend, there are some people that would say, no, I don't want to do that because I'm affected polarization is so high. And so understanding that can help us, like, you know, keep the representative benefits of the random sampling, but make sure that we know kind of our pools and stuff. Yeah, quickly, Kevin.
Yeah, so I want somebody to do a study.
Somebody do a study, please, looking at how many people they need when they have stratified requirements. Right?
Yeah.
We need these many people who don't have a college degree and so forth. I want to know how many people did they have to ask? What's the denominator
Yes.
for the different categories?
Yeah,
Right? 'Cause
and you have that, and like, you know, I talked to Helene about this. Like Iceland, you know, the people who wanted to do it were predominantly male and educated. Other places, you know, and we were thinking about inclusivity. Like Belgium did paper mailings, right? So they sent a letter, and I asked, like, how'd the youth do? Like, how, you know, would a youth get? And they said they actually had like pretty good youth participation, but like this is just like surveying how you recruit actually influences who participates like quite a bit. Anyway, thank you very much. We're going to now move to Federica, who's going to talk about, again, historical collective governance. So Federica, if you want to come on up. And then again, coffee and